PRIISM seminar jointly with Center for Open Science and Progress in a long time, I think since the pandemic. We're delighted today to have Professor Seth Flaxman joining us. Quick point of business before we get started. We will maybe ask clarifying questions during the talk, have them, otherwise let's hold on to substantive questions. And we'll make time for that. So with that, I'll introduce our speaker and then we can get started. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor Seth Flaxman, who is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science at Oxford. Seth's research is on spatiotemporal statistics and Bayesian machine learning applied to public policy, global health, and social science. He was part of the Imperial College COVID-19 response team, leading a number of publications on non-pharmaceutical interventions, computational epidemiology, and COVID-19 orphanhood. He's published on filter bubbles and echo chambers in media, the big data paradox, and the regulation of machine learning algorithms. He's the statistical lead for the Global Reference Group on Children Affected by COVID-19 and Crisis. Seth won the Samsung AI Researcher of the Year Award in 2020 and the SPI MO Award for Modeling and Data Support in 2022 for modeling advice provided to the UK government during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in 2022, Seth co-founded the Machine Learning and Global Health Network of researchers spanning 3 continents for the kickoff workshop held in Kigali, Rwanda at ICLR this year.
Thanks so much, Ravi. Thank you to the people who organized this and invited me. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Jennifer. I don't really know who's responsible, but thank you, everyone. Okay, so I bit off more than I can chew. I said case studies will include, and then I've got like 5 of them, but there's no way in 45 minutes plus time for questions I'll do 5. So I'm going to do 2 case studies today, but you'll see the other ones, and the slides are online, and you can take a picture of this slide, and how do I advance? Here we go. So if you want to see the other ones, take a picture of that and chat with me afterwards. But I'm going to do number 1 and number 4. But 2, 3, and 5 are great too, and there's papers that go with most of them, and I'm happy to talk about anything. I'll be around. Okay, so inferential artificial intelligence. Get you all thinking about that. I think this is a cool interdisciplinary audience that I might have a little bit of convincing to do for some of these things. We'll see. See if you buy it. So just to get you thinking about this, these are 2 papers, not what I'm going to present, but just to give you some papers that we did that I think exemplify iAI, this term that I might have made up. Maybe, if you like it. All credit to me. If you don't, I got it from somewhere else. So here we go. So here on the left, we are using satellite imagery and street view imagery, London, and we are trying to impute income, overcrowding, and environmental deprivation. So this gives us a very fine spatial scale observed surface, estimated surface for those variables. So this uses convolutional neural networks. That's the AI part, deep learning part. And I'm not going to talk about CNNs after this slide. Don't worry. Here is another application of AI, convolutional neural networks. Here we wanted to forecast rainforest deforestation in the Amazon. And what was very important to us was explainability and interpretability. So it's a little hard to see, but in fact, staring at these and looking at what we were able to do, we can give you leading indicators of deforestation, which include illegal mines, which include illegal roads, things that make sense, but previously or with other data sources, you wouldn't necessarily be able to identify. Okay, so what is machine learning? Back to Carnegie Mellon University, Professor Tom Mitchell. A computer program is said to learn from experience with respect to some class of tasks and a performance measure P if its performance, accuracy, yeah, AUC, if its performance at those tasks, as measured by the performance measure, improves with experience as you get more data. So I'm giving you this definition because I think it's a pretty good starting point. But when I talk about AI for the rest of this, I'm going to be talking very broadly. Computational statistics, applied statistics, machine learning, statistical machine learning. Yeah? Anything where we're using algorithms, probabilistic models in order to fit and estimate and predict and forecast with data. Okay, what about inference? So for me, inference is just going to be drawing conclusions from data. Not a philosophy talk. I'm not talking about inductive or deductive, just drawing conclusions from data. So put that together, Inferential artificial intelligence, this is using AI, by which I really mean machine learning and computational statistics, to draw conclusions from data. And I've got 2 case studies to tell you about. Lots of people to acknowledge and partners to mention. Here they are. The Machine Learning and Global Health Network is on 3 continents at the moment. 2, 3, but no one's in North or South America, so maybe we need to add some people. And yeah, thanks to all of the people who've provided data and provided good questions and have also pushed us to do useful things. Okay, so I'm going to start with SARS-CoV-2 transmission modeling. This is what I was doing exclusively from March 2020 until I dug myself out of it at the end of 2021. And then I'm going to talk about deep generative modeling, some of the most exciting stuff happening in AI for a very specific purpose: statistical inference, MC inference, fully Bayesian inference, but accelerating that with deep generative modeling. So 2 very different things, I think. Okay, case study number 1. So think back to March 2020. Maybe you were here. You probably weren't paying too much attention to the crazy things happening in Europe. In March 2020, in every European country, here are the 11 that were in the data set that we were looking at, many different non-pharmaceutical interventions were being brought in. Here we've got case-based self-isolation. You really have to think back to remember what in the world was that. That was if you had symptoms, you were mandated to self-isolate. And that was the first intervention that was brought in the data set that we assembled in Switzerland on 2nd of March, 2020. Yeah? And then we get to things like social distancing encouraged, that's work from home measures, public events being banned, schools being closed, and finally, very famously in Europe, lockdown, stay-at-home measures. And these things all come in rapid succession, real issues of collinearity here, because things are happening all at the same time. But we put together this data set very quickly, and perhaps more importantly, we built a new model to be able to ask and answer important questions. So what were the questions? Flipping back, we wanted to know about R effective, the time-varying reproduction number. We wanted to know about attack rates, what % of the population has been infected by the virus to date. And we wanted to eventually, later on, expand on the model in order to answer questions about new variants of concern, alpha, beta, gamma, sorry, British English, alpha, beta, gamma, Omicron. And so what was very important here was that everything that we did was written in a probabilistic programming language, in this case Stan, but it was quickly ported to TensorFlow probability and NumPyro by other groups. And everything was open source from the day that we released the report. And so if you do remember this stuff, this is not the famous report 9 from Imperial College, this is report 13. So it came a little bit later, and report 9 had models which were looking at simulations, and it was very influential. Our report 13 says, let's take data and let's fit models to that data, what we actually see already. We were fitting these, yeah, clarifying question, please.
So does that say that 9 was not based on data?
So 9 was based on epidemiological parameters. It was not possible, I don't know what day 9 was released, but it was too early. Ours was potentially too early too. This is a question, was ours too early? And so we were building our model throughout March, refitting it every day, every hour, every day we get new data. Jumping ahead, hierarchical models, partial pooling is how we're able to say something as quickly as we did. So here's the model. It's a semi-mechanistic Bayesian model. So mechanistic for me means that there is some actual, in this case, disease transmission model in it. So that's here in the middle. If someone is infected, they will infect people in the future. It's not a compartmental model for that. It's a different class of transmission models. It is a renewal process model. I'll show you the equation for that in a minute. But the important thing now is just to understand this part of the model is mechanistic. So we have someone infected after a given time period. The serial interval distribution, otherwise known as the generation time. So a certain number of days later, they will, some distribution, and this distribution, infect other people. Now, what makes it semi-mechanistic is that this gets changed by the time-varying reproduction number, right? So R is R changes its time varying because in our simple model back to March because of non-pharmaceutical intervention. So this is the statistical part of the model. Yeah. So lockdown, closing schools, all of those things have some data that changes the primary reproduction number, and the primary reproduction number changes how many secondary infections you get. These things could be inferred statistically, but we don't have data to infer them, so we have to go to the rapidly being studied epidemiological literature that fix it. That's something to keep in mind. You can't learn everything in this type of model because the data is just the curve of deaths. Lots of people were fitting their models to cases. I think this was a mistake in March 2020, 50% of the country, but I'll show you that on a plot. Modeled infections lead to modeled deaths, and again, we need an epidemiological parameter here. Population average infection fatality ratio. So again, think back, first wave, 100 people are infected in a high-income country with old people, now one of them will die. That's the IFR. Depends on the country, maybe it's 0.7% or 0.5%, but that was a number that we could not learn, and it was very controversial. And if we put a different number there, it would change everything about the effectiveness here, it would change everything about the attack rate, how many people get infected, etc. And then finally, we link it to data. So this whole model gets written down in probabilistic variable language, the likelihood comes in here. So I said open source from day one, and so this is the code. It was on GitHub. You can go back to see which days which things were released, and we made some updates as we were sending it off for publication and getting peer reviews back. But this is the basic model, and it was very important that it was online like this for us and for other people who downloaded it, who could understand exactly what we did, who could run it in their country with their particular setting, who could elaborate it in various ways and very quickly. New York State had a version of this model running with random walks. So rather than non-pharmaceutical interventions, they just had each week of the epidemic as it was unfolding, something different happened. More of a non-parametric approach. So that's just the data block, if you know Stan code. Here's the model block, just to show you that, very transparently, things are here, written down. This is the effectiveness of lockdown, and it is partial pooled, so it has a shared prior, but there's a different effect for every country. And then here are the mechanistic parts of the model. So the renewal equation, this is again an alternative if you're familiar with compartmental models, SIR. This is a different framework, but it works, I think, very nicely. Worked very nicely for us. The renewal equation, very specifically, I is infections, and G is the generation time, serial interval. So new generations through this convolution are generated every single day. Very few of them are generated on day one from someone who is infected on day 0. How the distribution works, and then by day 3 or 4, you have most of them. The primary reproduction number is right there. The percent of the population that's susceptible is right there. And it's just, there it is, very transparent. This looks a little more complicated because there's a dot product to make things computationally fast, but the original version of the code just had a for loop, and that was great if we have 30 days of data. It became a problem when we had 300 days of data. So yeah, any questions to this slide, to things I've said? Yeah. Yep, so I'm repeating the questions. How do you deal with sample size issues, relatively small number of countries? I will defer this for 2 slides. I have a slide that shows what we do. Okay, what about the death process? So again, there's a distribution. It takes about 22 days, convolution of these 2 distributions, before someone who's infected, on average, dies. And that's very important if you're just looking at the data and trying to understand what's happening. And it's something that lots of people forgot and still forgot over the course of the pandemic, that they thought, well, this social distancing measure, these lockdowns, I don't think they worked, because on March 18th, when they were brought in, things kept increasing, or, oh, the death curve was already starting to go down beforehand, or there are distributions that matter, and these distributions are based on epidemiology, but they're built into the model, and yeah, and then again, you've got a convolution, number of infections leads to a certain number of deaths based on the infection. And if you don't trust that, or you want to try and see what happens with a different IFR, download the code, make that tweak. And I said, this was very important to us. It didn't actually do us favors. If our code had been less reproducible, we would have had fewer critics because people could just download it, tweak one thing, write a matters arising criticizing us. But it was important to do it. Okay, so it's a Bayesian model. And every single day, we could refit it. We did refit it. And so this is in the supplementals of the Nature paper. And I'll play it once, and then I'll pause it. And it's so just every single day, we refit the model. Infections, deaths, primary reproduction, interventions. And so because it's partially pooled, there's 11 countries. Italy has the first lockdown. And so by March something, let's say by the end of March, the beginning of April, we are becoming pretty, actually I don't remember it being so high, that's weird. Oh, right, I'm looking at the wrong line because there's this little bar at the bottom. Okay, let me get that bar to go away so I can focus on the right line because the colors aren't showing up. So here we go. Let's let that bar go away. Will it go away? No, it just keeps playing. Okay, I'll go stand by it. I'm having trouble seeing it on this screen. Okay, so by the end of March, no. It's like a joke. Okay, by the end of March, that's how much data we have. By the end of March, this is the number of deaths we have. You can see the curve is starting to turn. Yeah, and the partial pulling out. The curve is not, it's still increasing in strength. But we are sharing strength, we are borrowing from the civil strength, and we're making an estimate that's not certain. The estimate says that basically a 50% chance the epidemic is now under control. It's not in France. Whereas in Italy, here's the line r equals 1, right above 1 it's growing, below 1 it's increasing, and so we're pretty clear here that it's below 1. And so that's why you can see that the number of infections is now going down. Which why so that was very important to be able to say, as we did in press releases, which were quoted in newspapers on March 30th, we believe that these measures have already started to control the epidemic, the pandemic. We believe that in a counterfactual in which these measures weren't brought in, there would be this many more deaths. And those were claims that rested strongly on this statistical model and on getting the epidemiology right. Either one of those you couldn't say.
So you also did the prediction saying what if in this counterfactual world?
Yes. So the counterfactual, somewhat criticized, was a simplistic one, but we said what it was stay with R naught, stay with the beginning of the growth. And of course, eventually things go down because of herd immunity, but that takes a lot longer. And so we looked at a very specific time period, how many deaths were averted. And by the time we get to the paper covers until May 4th, which is when Italy reopens, it was 3 million deaths averted in these 11 European countries. I want to pull that door close. Cool. All right, so to Daniel's question, what do you do when you only have a little bit of data? Well, we were not able to, in the original paper, say much about ranking these different interventions. It was very clear, although there's still some question I think that people have about the confounding of the timing of these things, but it was very clear that lockdown had a big effect, and that effect was stronger than the effect of the other interventions, but we could not identify different interventions. We couldn't rank these. By the time that there's a different paper that has about 15 countries and 7 different non-pharmaceutical interventions, so this is the NumPyro version of our paper, basically, they were able to get things that were a little bit better identified. And here they, I think, to answer the critics that we didn't realize we should have answered, additional benefit of stay-at-home, lockdown, on top of the other NPIs, and then it was a lot lower, right? Whereas ours was just lockdown, but lockdown implies all the others. You can't go to public events if you're being forced to stay at home. And then we worked with those authors on a paper that covers 35 province level, admin 1, state level, regions of countries, a whole bunch more non-pharmaceutical interventions, and you can see some very interesting results, if you can read them. If you can't read them, let me know. All non-essential businesses closed, that one has the largest effect. All gatherings banned, that one has the second largest effect. And then these things are breaking that up into different NPIs. But it's the same basic model. One thing that gets added is cases. I meant to mention cases here. There are cases, you can barely see them, but they're not part of the model because they were so severely underreported, not really reported, it's under ascertained. There was not any testing happening in Italy on April 6th, right? Okay, so then what do? We take this model and we do all sorts of things with it. This is every local area in England. And we were just getting this set up and running it in September, October, November of 2020. And then in December of 2020, there had been another lockdown in the UK, and it had ended, but it hadn't actually controlled cases in some regions. And the paper here is in Nature. Eric Voles is the first author, my colleague at Imperial. He was tracking the genomics of this, and so this was, it turns out, what was happening. We wrote this paper, the first variant of concern that mattered, the first novel variant of concern, B117, later called alpha, arising in the southeast of England. And so in regions where that was spreading, we were able to show that that was driving an increasing epidemic. R was above 1. In regions where it hadn't yet spread, the not very strong lockdown, schools were open, was controlling the wild type, the original one. And so that is something, I'll point you to the paper, I guess I don't have the slides. That is something that we did using this model for every local area, the estimates that it gives us of RFT, and then just the linear regression. And so, you know, eventually we go back, a month later we go back for a different setting for Brazil, for a different variant for P1, and we change the model to add genomic information to make it a 2-strain model, 1 variant, wild type. But sometimes for speed and because you can get a basic answer that is right, Boris Johnson gives a press conference and said in it, up to 70% more transmissible. Where did this number came from? It came from a linear regression based on these estimates. Okay, so that is the end, perfectly on time. We can even ask a few questions now. That is the end of the first case study. So to recap, we used Bayesian hierarchical semi-mechanistic models. We implemented them in Stan. I like Stan a lot, but NumPyro is pretty great too. And there's a version of this in NumPyro that is a little bit faster, can run on GPUs. Probabilistic programming was very important to making this possible to do in real time. And it was very, very important to us that as we released our preprints, which we then submitted, all along the way, there was open source replicable code. Anyone could download it. Anyone could claim that we were, you know, somehow cooking the books, trying to show some policy outcome, whatever. I don't need to talk about critics. And so, yeah, to say why this was great, it gave us the ability to ask and answer time-critical public policy questions and to characterize uncertainty. And so one note about the Boris Johnson saying 70%, that was like the upper end of the 95% confidence interval, and maybe that's not what we want the press to focus on. In the subsequent work using this same model for 2 strains, for Manaus in Brazil, for P1, the gamma variant, we carefully decided that we were going to present 50% Bayesian credible intervals instead of 95% Bayesian credible intervals, because we knew that people would just focus on one endpoint. And, you know, it's a little bit of a question if that was the right thing to do, but we did not want there to be really over-the-top headlines. There still were, of course, and maybe there should have been. Okay, so that's the end of case study 1. Questions? You can also ask at the end. You can also catch me. Yeah. Okay. Just 100, please.
Yeah. So trade-offs in making your right? So you mentioned some of the downsides. On the upsides, besides being built right into it, right? And a lot of other people to feed on what you're doing, build their own models, etc. Other things, did you ever feel back from people like, oh, you know, actually, we tried it and this wasn't good work for our study, maybe you should go with blah 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 into the model. Was there any of that kind of feedback?
Question was downsides and upsides. I mentioned some of the downsides. What were the upsides? Did we hear back from people? Constantly. Yes, this was like all the time. People were emailing us. Mostly useful, mostly useful. People were putting up preprints where they had tweaked one parameter and then making wild claims based on that. And that was confusing and took some of our time to figure out what in the world was going on. But, you know, it was still informative on some levels, just did kind of waste our time. But, you know, that's scientific debate and discourse. And yeah, for sure.
And then
Lots of scrutiny.
Compared to other models that were out there at the time, how much of the differences between what you were doing and what others were doing has to do with Bayesian or the moment that this case
So the major differences that the choices that we made were, it was two. It was to, on the one hand, it's the semi-mechanistic thing. It's on the one hand to be using and relying on and working together with part of the team, part of the authors, epidemiologists. Yeah? And so like one of the key parameters in this model is that infection fatality ratio that I mentioned, and that was estimated by my colleague at Imperial College, Bob Verity, based on the earliest data coming out of China, coming from people flying home and how many of them died, coming from one of the cruise ships. And that mattered a lot, and we hung our hats on that estimate. And if it had been wrong, like everything else would have been wrong. So that's not something that the statistics could have ever saved us. It was like we had to choose the right parameter there. And of course, we can do sensitivity analyses about these things, but the substantive conclusions we reached relied on that. And then on the other hand, doing it as a Bayesian model meant that we were characterizing uncertainty. Doing it using statistical methods meant that, now these were not machine learning. We tried some machine learning in here in various ways, but we wanted everything to be interpretable. And so doing it as a hierarchical Bayesian model. We also got in a lot of trouble just around this question of lockdown. That parameter was partially pooled. Some of the other parameters were not partially pooled. And like people, again, sort of accused us of having set things up in such a way to sweep under the rug the amazing success story of Sweden or some crazy thing like that, because Sweden famously didn't have anything that they called a lockdown, although they had very strong social distancing measures for many months. So, yeah. Yeah. So the causal question, repeating the question, should we be worried that these estimates are simply associational, not causal, and does that matter from the policy perspective? And so it mattered a lot for these debates. We went back as soon as we could and had other data. And so the other data that comes in, and immediately we used it in the United States setting, but then we kind of shy away from the effectiveness in the non-pharmaceutical interventions, and we just use mobility. Mobility is the new data that came in. Other people, and we did it ourselves, later on tried to answer exactly this question. Like, if behavior captured by mobility is explaining a lot of what's going on here, then how much can we say is due to the governmental measures? And so it's pretty hard to disentangle. There's still papers coming out on it and trying to use formal causal inference methods. I don't know where, I've sort of gone around in circles on this, but I think in terms of giving real-time policy advice, the thing that matters is what is the behavior of the public, and that's something that we can observe. Whether or not we know that that happened because people are scared, or because people are rightly looking at what's happening and they're not scared, but they're taking decisions to protect themselves and others, or they're following the rules. Whatever the causal reason is, we can observe what people are doing because there was this almost real-time mobility data. And we can see the impact that that had on the spread of the virus. And so I think that was where I came down in real time, that the advice that people needed, governments needed, was about these epidemiological questions. Of course, the causal behavior part is really important too. In the UK, there was SPI-MO, the committee doing modeling and giving that to a SAGE, the committee that was then advising the government. There was SPI-B, the behavioral committee that had psychologists and other people on it. They were also doing really interesting work. It wasn't making its way up. Well, I don't know that anything was making its way up to the government, but they're important questions that, yeah, I don't think were necessarily being listened to. Okay, you ready for something completely different? What did I say I was going to do? Deep generative modeling, yeah? Cool. So here we go. Show of hands for people who fit Bayesian models with MCMC ever? All right, cool. So sometimes your models might take a little while to run, yeah? Or a day, or a month, or whatever. It doesn't converge. And so the big selling point of what we're doing here, on the one hand, is just, let's just speed that up. And so sorry, the slides need a bigger screen. But it's hard to read. So the conditional autoregressive model, this is like a workhorse baseline spatial statistics model. It's says that what's happening here is similar to the surrounding universe. The car model ran in 277 seconds on this big spatial problem, UK regions, and it gave me 317 effective samples. So I don't know if it gave 500 samples, but there's no question. So 317 effective sample size, and thus we divide those things, one effective sample per second. That's not very good. Yeah, I'm kind of impatient. I don't really want to wait for 2,000 seconds to get 2,000 samples. Okay, our new method, variational autoencoder car. So deep generative model that emulates the true prior that we care about car, gave us 3,000 effective samples. It took 8 seconds, and so that's 400 effective samples per second. So way faster, a 350 times speed up. Okay, so that's the advertisement. What are we doing? So here is a variational autoencoder. If you've never seen this before, it gets used for all sorts of kind of frivolous computer vision tasks. Like here's a cat, and we're going to feed it into the encoder. Forget about the variational part for a second. There's also something called autoencoders. We're going to feed this cat into the encoder. This is a multi-level deep neural network. And then we're going to encode it down to a low-dimensional encoding C. And then we're going to feed that to a different neural network, a decoder, which is trying to recover that picture of a cat. And typically, if you haven't trained them for very long, things look a little blurry. Yeah? So the other example that if you download any of the tutorials, it'll be like the MNIST digit. So you'll feed in a 3, and you'll get a 3 out, handwritten. You'll feed in a 2, you'll get a 2 out. Yeah? So people have seen this before? Great. Okay, so variational autoencoder adds a little bit of regularization. It has a specific interpretation in terms of generative modeling, which I only sort of buy, but the regularization, I think, is very clear. It says that I want to be able to sample here from some prior. And in particular, I want a very, very, very simple prior. IID draws from a normal distribution, 0 variance 1. So that is Z is d-dimensional, then we want to draw from normal 0, I, D. Yeah? And so if I regularize by putting a Kullback-Leibler divergence on that distribution in the middle, then suddenly I have a model that I can plug in any random draw, Z, normal 0, I, and get beautiful pictures of hallucinated cats. Yeah? Or digits, or whatever we want, whatever we train it on. So that's VAEs in a nutshell. Are there any questions just about the basic setup? Because if you didn't get that part, it's going to be a little weird what I do next. So I will happily explain. People have seen this before? Okay, so what if instead of cats, I have draws from a particular statistical prior, a probability distribution that I'm interested in using at scale, often in MCMC. So here's a picture of a function. Let's imagine this is drawn from a Gaussian process. If you don't know about GPs, let's imagine this is drawn from a multivariate Gaussian distribution at a set of locations. So just some prior distribution. Could even be a one-dimensional thing, right? We could even say, okay, I'm going to take draws from a log normal distribution. Yeah. So here we go. We've got that draw from a GP, and we're going to plug it into our VAE. And so what are we going to get out? We're going to get out basically the same thing, maybe a little bit blurrier. And so I'm in a setting here. I mean, there are a lot of cat pictures online, but I'm in a setting where I really have infinite data because I'm generating it. So I write down the prior distribution I care about, Gaussian processes, multivariate Gaussians, whatever it is. I generate as much data as I want on the fly, usually is how you'd implement this, no reason to store that data. And I train my neural network ad infinitum until I'm really happy that my neural network is able to encode and decode. I think I forgot to mention the loss function. Y minus y hat, or you can write it down here in probabilities. Mean squared error, reconstruction loss, the simplest possible thing, that's the loss. And then there's the scale divergence that I realize. Very, very, you can find tutorials on every single deep learning framework, TensorFlow, PyTorch, Keras, anything, will give you a VAE. And then you can feed it, instead of pictures of cats, you can feed it in any prior distribution draws from it that you might be interested in. And so it turns out that we can now use this for MCMC inference. So how? What do we do? So we don't need the encoder anymore. This part is no longer useful to us. We just need the decoder. Because we can just take this and stick it in any type of Bayesian inference scheme. And in particular, it's very convenient to put that into probabilistic programming language and then to run MCMC. So here we go. So this is NumPyro code. Should have changed it to Stan maybe for this audience, but I will try to tell you what's going on. It's in Python, and it's a function, and it says that sigma is like an observation model. This is for a normal IID likelihood on top of the random process. Sigma is got a half normal distribution with standard deviation of 1. Okay, so this is, there's no VA circuit. This is just how do I write down an actual Gaussian process prior to likelihood in NumPyro. Okay, F. Then F is a latent function, a smooth function that I was drawing, and smooth out some time series data. In 2 dimensions, this is going to be a smooth spatial surface. Well, for a specific set of locations, a Gaussian process is just a multivariate Gaussian. So I just write down multivariate normal with mean 0 and some fixed covariance matrix. Already start thinking how many one that covariance matrix. Okay, and so that gives us a prior for sigma, a prior for F. And then I've got some observed data at a certain set of observation locations. And so at those observation locations, the likelihood says Y is normally distributed with mean F and standard deviation sigma. That's the whole model. No VAEs, nothing fancy. That's how you write down without using conjugacy, right? We could actually have written down in closed form, but let's imagine that we're going to very shortly switch to non-normal likelihoods. There's some reason to do this in its full generality and not resort to Bayesian tricks. Okay, so how are we going to emulate this? How are we going to speed this up? So we need the decoder from that VAE. Remember the decoder, here it is. Here's that decoder. And we're going to implement that here. It's a very simple neural network. It's got a linear layer, so weights and biases. So that's just E1 times Z matrix multiplication. Sorry, W1 times Z matrix multiplication for weights plus B1 bias. Linear regression, non-linear, rectified linear unit, and that's the hidden layer, and then we have some more weights and biases, and that's it. It's a very, very simple one hidden layer neural network. And we're going to use that trained decoder. We're not retraining these weights. This comes from that long process of training the. We're going to take that decoder and we're going to stick it in here. Previously, we used the multivariate normal distribution. That's the true prior. Now we're going to emulate that prior by sampling Z from a normal distribution and plugging those samples in deterministic into the decoder. So the randomness now has replaced this expensive. I didn't say why it's expensive. Why is it expensive? Why don't we like this? Why were those effective sample sizes bad? Lots and lots of correlation, high-dimensional space among these parameters. It's very hard to explore with MCMC. And the matrix algebra gets costly. If we have 1,000, if you have n observations, it becomes order n cubed. So by the time you get from 1,000 to 10,000, you're paying a lot of compute time to invert that. Whereas this deterministic F, decoder numpy for some Z, is just a feed-forward neural network. No matrix conversion required. And we're not learning any parameters here. We're learning the Z's. The Z is really easy sample, the normal 0i. So I showed you already how well it works in terms of effective samples. But I don't know if I have one here, but there are examples where, no joke, the effective sample sizes are larger than the true sample size because it's so easy to explore that space. We're using HMC, we're using standard NumPyro. It's making these jumps that are anti-correlated. It's like the opposite of what you usually see with MCMC. And it's kind of amazing that you can do that. But it kind of makes sense. We've put all of the work, and it wasn't fast, we put all of the work into training the neural network so that our life is much easier the next day when we're using it for inference. Okay, so questions about this setup? Yeah. Okay, well, here is why we're just doing something that you've already seen before, and thus it's not something for nothing. How do you sample from a multivariate normal distribution? Who knows? You take, one way to do it, you take the covariance matrix, and you take like a matrix decomposition, Cholesky decomposition. So I have K, I also need a chalkboard, K equals L transpose. And how do I draw new samples? I take Z, just like you did there. Z is drawn from normal 0I, and then I take L matrix product Z, and that's F. Those are my samples from the multivariate normal. Yeah, and that's just closed form. I can write that down. There's some computational issues. Sometimes you can't do the Cholesky decomposition. You have to add some jitter, whatever. That's all like very straightforward, and you can just write that in 3 lines of R code. I could just write that in 3 lines of R code. Maybe that's what I should have done. We are learning a nonlinear version of that, and that's it. And so there's some compression, there's some smoothing that happens if Z is lower dimensional. I think it actually has a direct analog. What's it called? Finite rank Cholesky decomposition. Anyone know? Someone told me this at a talk, but I never looked it up. I don't know. There is some version of that. But the Z doesn't have to be lower rank, right? It could be that Z has exactly the same dimensionality as Y. That works pretty well too. We had to do that for some of our spatial examples. So yeah, I don't think there is magic. I'll show you the magic, but so far I don't think there's been anything that I can't explain. I'll show you the magic. Okay, so it looks really well. It works really well. It looks really good. So this is priors, and they kind of look like what we expect. You can see the color start, and then we have 2 data points that they concentrate. So these are draws from the host area, right? Additionally, 2 data points. Now we have 4 data points. Now we have, I don't know, I can't read it. Can't read anything. 6 data points, I think. So, you know, it does what you want. Here it is for spatial data, and we get those big speed ups I was mentioning before. So the observed data is here. We're smoothing it out using a small area estimation model called CAR, and then we are emulating that model with our variational autoencoding CAR, and we're getting huge speed ups, 70 times speed ups in terms of just the MCMT inference. You do have to pay to encode the model, so we should sort of think through here for 1 minute, what's the workflow? So I do a lot of work, it turns out, with colleagues in Zimbabwe. The districts that we have there are fixed. So I'm going to spend a day or 2, hypothetically, when we get all of the pieces together, training the VAE model to give me a good spatial prior. But then I'm just going to be able to use it for the next year for all the different problems that I have in mind. And so that's the hope. We're not there yet, but there's lots of geographies out there, and you can imagine, okay, now I care about the counties of New York State, so I'm going to train a new model for that. Might take a couple hours to train, should be pretty automatic, and then you can go from there. Okay, so more just examples, UK, smoothing things out in the UK. Let me tell you what else you could do with this. This is where we want to go next, and I want to hear what you might think about doing with this, because I've only shown you really Gaussian processes, but this idea goes well beyond that. So here are some slides about making it possible to learn hyperparameters. For that, I will just say that exists, it's on archive, but a new version is coming soon, and basically, you can also learn hyperparameters. You can make it into a model where we don't lose that information. I didn't say anything about learning the kernel, length scale, whatever it is, but you really can do that as well. So have a look at this archive paper when it gets updated this week, or just ask me for the PDF. But what are other things that we can do? Well, one other thing we can do is the full stochastic process functions. And so that's here. And I don't know that I'm going to go into too much detail about that, although that's really where there's some magic. But if you really care about a full stochastic process, you can't say in advance where are the locations that I observe it, which is the trick I've been using the whole time for multivariate Gaussians. And so we do have a way of doing that. That's nice. A little more complicated, please. Yeah. So in the full generality, I've got some observed locations, and they're in continuous space. And then later on, I'm going to make some predictions at some other locations. I don't know what those are, and so I really want a random function, not just a random vector. But we do have a way of solving that problem, which I can tell you about. But yeah, that's a different paper, and by all means, if you want to hear about that more. But what I want to get to is how we can use this for things that are not just, I care a lot about GPs and they're slow, but all sorts of other models, even models that we saw earlier, mechanistic models. So this is the PyVA thing. Here's the magic where we get these really good training. Testing errors, a little unclear how we did that. Should come back to that. It really is a stochastic process. That's nice. Here's the papers. Okay, so what about other things? So what if I had an SIR model, back to compartmental modeling, what I said I wasn't doing, but this is a nice simple example. So SIR, reminding you, susceptibles, how many people in the population could be infected. SI, how how many people are infected. R, how many people have recovered or died. Yeah, SIR, it's a differential equation model. And it's really easy to simulate from because you can just write down this set of differential equations and just take discrete time steps and you get beautiful simulation. But inference isn't that easy, and there's been lots of work, and in these simple models you can at this point, write that down in something like Stan. But for the more complex versions of this and for stochastic differential equations, people resort to things like ABC that are really slow, approximate Bayesian computation. Yeah, it's sort of like, I mean, the real heuristic way that people still do it is they say, okay, I don't know what these parameters are. Maybe this is a good set of parameters, simulate forward. Nah, that doesn't look like the data. Maybe this is a good set of parameters, simulate forward. And so our idea, which we're now trying to push forward on all sorts of different settings, but I'd love to hear about things that you care about where it's hard to do inference, is to take those simulators, those models, those priors, ask them for infinite data, encode that with an appropriate VAE, and so now we might need to think about different architectures, things that are appropriate for images, if it's sort of two-dimensional data, things that are appropriate for time series. This is a time series of the number of infections. Whatever it is, we need to encode it. And then that's it, we have a drop-in replacement. And so this is this challenging double well SD, I don't know so much about it. And you can see that we're not quite there. We're sort of still over-smoothing a little bit. This one's pretty good. But the idea is the same. We spend a lot of compute, we use a lot of neural network tricks to emulate something, and then we throw that out, we take our emulator, and we put it into a probabilistic programming language, and we do full Bayesian inference. And I think it's somehow a lot of people have had partly this idea, but they've gone too far. Like if you look at the diffusion models for stochastic processes, if you look at neural processes, everyone's trying to use neural networks, variational inference usually, and do the whole inference problem. And I think that's a mistake. I don't think variational inference often works. And if it does, we don't know that it does. And I think that you do know how to fit applied stats models in probabilistic programming languages, or even for that matter, in simpler things, what's it called? LME4, yeah? Those sorts of hierarchical models. All I want is to be able to have that full generality and to be able to embed into it more complex models, be they spatial or SIR or anything else that you can write down a simulator for. And there are people who do like applied probability, basically theoretical mathematicians, and they have these very cool models, and then at the end of their talks you ask them like, do you know how to do inference on that? No idea. But I think we kind of do now, so that's very exciting. Okay. Questions on this, and then I'll just do a recap and questions at the end.
When you actually talk about this with folks, like this seems to me, the conversations I've had with physicists, this seems well aligned with the problems that they encounter. Mostly because I've had conversations with physicists who they try to engage me on these things, and I'm like, you should talk to someone like that. Is that a good audience?
Totally. The question was, what about physicists? So yeah, a lot of like physics-informed neural networks, but I'm still claiming that people have like missed out on a very simple trick, and that very simple trick is to make it a two-stage process. Don't make it a one-stage process. Here is a two-stage model, and this will let you do Bayesian inference. And people they just want to go for the whole thing, but I don't know why. I think that there's something really nice to be said about let's think carefully about the prior that we have, and it really can be a mechanistic prior. It could be an agent-based simulation of the world with economic actors who are also getting infected, whatever it is. And then let's spend a fair amount of compute, but it should be pretty automatic because we have infinite data, emulating that. And then we can do Bayesian inference. Or non-Bayesian. That's the other thing we've never bothered with, talking about just skipping steps. Like, I don't know, maybe I can just do optimization here. Why do I need to do sampling? Yeah. Which slide? Zimbabwe. Great. I don't know if anyone is actually online. I see one person. I'll repeat the question for other people's benefit here anyway. Good to recap. These pictures are, I sometimes get these terms wrong, geostatistical, aerial unit model. These are the districts of Zimbabwe, admin 2. And that's useful and policy relevant, and often that's like the right answer in some sense. But then if you think about it, like if it's a health district, people who live, on this side of the border of the district, often they can go wherever they want, and if the good health clinic is over there, they're going to cross the border. Yeah? Sometimes it's not true. There's like a very strong border between Portugal and Spain when it comes to where vultures fly because of different laws about like agriculture or something. So sometimes these geophysical things are somehow policy relevant. Whatever. This model is a aerial unit model, but often we would like to go down to like continuous space or really the pixel level. And so to do that, we need to switch models. And so this model that we show here is conditional autoregressive, and it really is this location is related to the ones around it, but it's a weird model. I don't know if you've looked into these things. It's tractable because it's a sparse precision matrix. Precision matrices are the inverse of covariance matrices. Covariance matrices we can kind of think about. How related is it here to over there? How related is New York to Massachusetts? Precision matrices, like, you can because of conditional independence also reason about them, but I think in the spatial stats literature, it's sort of agreed like, it's just a little hack that makes things possible. We don't really believe that model. So a better model might be a continuous Gaussian field, a Gaussian process, yeah? Every single location has a value, and there's a covariance matrix that tells us something about the distance, and that covariance matrix could even have other features. It could have things about, well, it could be non-stationary, for example. So you can spend a lot of time thinking about that model. And then here's the trick. You don't need the PyVAE thing. You can aggregate it up. Yeah, so you can have the continuous surface, but if you only ever have observed data at these aerial units, you can do that integral, and we do this in one of the papers. You can do that integral, and then that can be what you observe. And so that's the other thing I sort of forgot to mention about this when I was just showing these cool plots, is that you can also have all sorts of properties of these things. So we have one paper on Cox processes. Cox process is a doubly stochastic point process. You need the integral of the intensity function. Well, guess what? If you're going to simulate from this model, you know everything about it, including its integral. And so you can take that number, right? An integral is just a real number, and you can also encode that along with the picture of the cat. And that will be something that comes out of your decoder. So it's suddenly also a new way to write down things that otherwise really there isn't a closed form for. So for example, monotonically increasing positively constrained functions. I don't know how to do inference about that, but if I can come up with any way of simulating from it, then suddenly I can do inference. Other questions? Oh, I should sum up. I've got a last slide. Not here, not here, not here, but here we go. Okay, so I told you about a couple of these. To remind you, my definition for iAI is using artificial intelligence, using machine learning, using computational statistics to draw conclusions from data. If you're taking a picture of it, we had our first machine learning and global health workshop in Kigali. Here's a picture from it in May. There's my PhD student, Giovanni. We were seeing these golden monkeys, and you have to get PCR tested and wear masks around them because we're not supposed to give them COVID either. Yeah, thanks so much.